was pretty overwhelming. First of all, congratulations on an extremely powerful movie.
Thank you.
I guess watching it, one of the things that strikes me is that these issues are still there. I was in Georgia in 2020. I went to the place where Ahmaud Arbery, a young black man, was literally hunted down by the McMichaels. He was jogging through a subdivision, shot dead at point-blank range. The assault on voting in Wilmington, we see it today in the assault on voting rights, the redlining that goes on with property ownership. So while some things have changed, a lot has not. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. But that's why we fight. We fight for this vision of democracy. I think one of the things about the United States is that it's an aspirational nation. When it says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that's the aspiration. We know that the nation was not founded as fulfilling that aspiration. But what you see historically is this battle to make that aspiration real.
And you still believe that we'll get there one day?
Oh, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe.
Why is this history so little known? I mean, one couple of people in the movie said, I wasn't really aware of this, not aware of Wilmington, not aware of Hamburg. How prominent is the teaching of this in high schools?
It's really not there in our books. Where you might see it is at the college level if you happen to take a specialized course in African American history, but you generally won't see it in a generalized US history course. But you can see how foundational it is to understand that there was an actual coup, that you had elected officials who were kicked out of office in the midst of a massacre. And so that's why when Reverend Armour was like, when black folks saw January 6th, we were like, oh yeah, because Wilmington. But this isn't there. And part of the thing that we're dealing with is that we have had a massive push in the States to make sure that this kind of history is not taught.
Just as there's always a massive push to make sure that a limited number of black people vote. I mean, that is what the Republicans are doing, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. It's in an interview with the New York Times. I said that right now American democracy is under a land, sea, and air attack. The land attack is on voting rights, and those are the numbers of voter suppression bills that you see coming through that masquerade themselves as protecting democracy as part of election integrity. But they're about anything but. It's because you had this massive voter turnout that kicked Donald Trump out of the White House and that flipped the US Senate and maintained the control of the House. And so you get the assault on voting rights. The sea attack is the washing away of teaching real American history by saying it's divisive and that you don't want white children to feel uncomfortable in this history class. And the air attack is the loosening up of gun laws in the United States while you're having the Republicans say that political violence is a legitimate political discourse. So you get the rise of these right-wing militias and you get greater access to guns. And so you link voting with the intimidation that comes from guns and with eliminating this history so folks think that we haven't been here before. That is the assault on American democracy right now. That's why this history is so important.
And how dangerous do you think it is? Came pretty close on January 6th. Do you think we're out of the woods?
Oh, we are not out of the woods. The midterm election in November 2022 is going to be absolutely decisive. because we have a number of election deniers, those who were in league with or who believed that what they saw on January 6th was okay and legitimate because the election was supposedly stolen from Donald Trump, although there is no evidence.
None, right?
None. I mean, they have looked. Zero, zilch, nada. Of widespread election fraud. Nothing that would overturn the results of this election. But still, the myth is so powerful and so strong that we have a number of election deniers running in key positions, such as governor, secretary of state, and attorney general, who would, all of those would have the power to overthrow the will of the people and ensconce Donald Trump back into the White House. That's why this 2022 election is so important. It's to keep those election deniers away from the levers of power.
We've had these moments in American history, Emmett Till in 1955 in his casket, 1963 in Birmingham, 1965, I think, in Mississippi, the 3 boys murdered, obviously George Floyd in 2020. And there are these moments when I think white Americans wake up for a moment and ask themselves, how can we tolerate what has happened in this country, and what are we actually going to do to change it? Do you think the George Floyd moment is producing, will produce real substantial change?
I think the George Floyd moment is why we are seeing, part of the reason why we're seeing this massive backlash in terms of the teaching of real American history. I remember there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, D.C., and the cops were coming at this young black man, and a young white woman got in between the cops and that black man because she understood her incredible privilege and power in that moment. And I see that as a kind of crystallization, this kind of, ooh, how did she do that? How did she know to do that? Why is she doing that? We have got to make sure that our children don't do that. It was her awareness that shocked them, that stunned them, that they said, we can't have this kind of solidarity. We can't have what we had in 1898 with the fusion principle, where you had blacks and whites working together for a much more broader, expansive, more equitable America. We can't have that, and that's the reason why we're seeing this backlash.
Instead of fusion, we got fracture.
Yes, we got fraction, but I think
Fracture.
Fracture. I think part of what we're also seeing, though, is that there are folks who are fighting back. I mean, that's where the hope is. There are folks who are fighting back. When we understand that this right wing is a small fraction of the American population. They're loud, they're noisy, they are well-funded, and they have a medium, Fox News, to really just kind of amplify and broadcast this message, to make them seem bigger than they were. I think about it when you had the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks called themselves Bolsheviks, which meant the majority. And they called the vast numbers of other Russians the Mensheviks, which meant the minority. So it was a way of psychologically, linguistically using the language to amplify their power that they did not have. And that's what we're seeing with this right wing, but you're seeing people fight back because they know how precious democracy is.
So you have to meet organization and propaganda with your own organization and persuasion.
Oh, yes.
To get results.
Absolutely. There's incredible organizing that is happening in the communities. There's organizing that's happening where the issues and what's at stake are being made crystal clear and not put behind gauzy language. It's like, this is what's at stake. Women's ability to control their own body at stake. The environment, climate change, at stake. the right to vote and have a representative government at stake, and the ability to be safe in our schools at stake. I mean, when it becomes really crystal clear like that, this is why you're seeing this massive registration, for instance, of women disproportionately, that's happening in terms of voter registration after the US Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, which basically overturned Roe v. Wade, that allowed women to control their own bodies, their own reproductive rights. After that, you started seeing women just coming out in droves registering to vote. When it's really clear what's at stake, you're seeing the kind of engagement we need to protect this democracy.
My parents were South African, and my dad was a physician, and he was the last dean, the dean of the last residency at Wits University in Johannesburg that was still admitting black students. And when that was shut down in 1957, he said, "That's enough for me, we're getting out of this country." And I was 2, and we moved to Britain. And I remember asking him about that, and he just said, the waste, the waste, the waste. The talent wasted. He just couldn't stand watching at that. And after the end of apartheid, a lot of white South Africans that I knew said, well, we didn't really know what was going on. Yeah, bad things were happening. We didn't really know. Do you think that's true to some degree in the United States, that white people say they don't really know, or they're not really aware of what you demonstrate so powerfully in this movie?
I think that we've got some of that happening. I mean, so when it comes to voting, for instance, one of the things that happened after the US Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when the Supreme Court gutted it in 2013, states that had been under that law just rushed to do all kinds of mess. One of those was to close polling places, overwhelmingly in black and poor communities, which meant then that you had these, because of residential segregation, you have in Georgia, for instance, in precincts that are 90% white, their average time that they wait to vote is 6 minutes. In precincts that are 90% black, the average time is about an hour.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes.
Just say that again. It's important.
Yes. In precincts that are 90% white, the average time to vote is 6 minutes. In precincts that are 90% black, the average time is about an hour. What that means then is that when black folks talk about the barriers to voting, because you begin to think about your time, midday, and the traffic in Atlanta, so trying to get to your polling place on time and then trying to get to work and to deal with this long wait, that is some real serious calculations that have to go on. But when black folks say it, it's like, I don't understand. I'm able to vote. You know, I'm able to vote. I get in and out. And so residential segregation allows the kind of myth-making, the willful ignorance of the conditions that other American citizens have to deal with in order to exercise their right to vote.
I went to an exhibition in New York recently at the Jewish Museum about the years 1962 to 1964, civil rights movement, assassination of President Kennedy. And there was a poster that really struck me, and the poster said, this was in the midst of the civil rights movement, "Stop police brutality. Stop police brutality." That was now, what, 60 years ago? Mm-hmm. What about that?
And that also is one of the things where there is this kind of blind spot, where there's this sense that there is law and order, that all you have to do is comply with the police and you're fine. All you have to do is obey the rules. What we know is that African Americans are 3 times more likely, I believe that's the figure, to be gunned down by the police than whites. And if they are unarmed, they're 1.3 times more likely to be gunned down. by the police. And so the way that African Americans experience the police and the way that whites experience the police are so fundamentally different. And that's why the
If you
video-
get stopped driving and you're white, you're okay.
Oh, yeah.
If you're black, you may well not be okay. I mean, that is a very fundamental difference, right?
It is an absolutely true fundamental difference. It's that you know that every encounter with the police may be the your last moment here on earth. And that's why the video image of George Floyd was so stunning, because there you saw the brutality up close and unrelenting as Floyd is begging for his life, as he's saying, "I can't breathe." And you see the callousness of Derek Chauvin as he's got his knee on Floyd's neck. And you hear Floyd calling for his mother, who is dead. And you see Chauvin unrelenting, just standing there, just sitting there like, "Yeah, I got him, I got him." It was watching 9 minutes of that murder that so stunned the nation. It was like, oh, maybe black folks aren't making this up. And we're like, no, we're not making this up. This is how it works. This is how it rolls. We need true police reform. We need true accountability.
Need to become visible.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me about the Obama presidency. The first black president, it felt transformative. How transformative was it?
So one of the things is that when Obama became president, the U.S. got its swag on, right? It started like, yeah, we have overcome. Did you see what we just did? Yeah, we elected a black man to the White House. We did that. I mean, the swag was just like, woo! Except when you dig down in the numbers, you have a very different tale. Because the whoo, did you see what we just did, basically is saying that the majority of whites voted for Obama. Actually, the majority of whites have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964, since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And the majority of whites did not vote for Obama either. He had a sizable number, but not the majority. So you might ask yourself, how on earth did Obama get into the White House? Well, he had an incredible ground game that brought in new voters, folks who had not cast a ballot before. They were overwhelmingly black, Latino, Asian American, young, and poor. I mean, millions of new voters. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. Those groups would become the targets for voter suppression. And so Obama was really on a high wire act with no net in what he was trying to do. He couldn't be too black because he would get slammed immediately. He couldn't be too radical because, again, he would get slammed immediately. Obama was able to pull off the Affordable Care Act is a political miracle, given all of the forces, including an intransigent, obstructionist Congress that he had to deal with for the majority of his 2 terms in office. But the very being of Obama is what I call, had created what I call white rage, which was the kind of sense that, look at black folks have made a significant gain, we can't have that. So folks wonder, how do you go from Obama to Donald Trump? I mean, because let's face it, Trump is what I call the un-Obama. He has none of the characteristics. He's not inquisitive, he's not smart, he's not elegant, he's not. He's just not. And so how do you go from Obama to Trump? Well, what Trump brought, particularly for the disaffected, those who felt that they were losing their country, they were losing their nation, was he put what I call a kilo of pure uncut white supremacy on the table and said, snort. That was what birtherism was, where you delegitimize the black president. You're saying he was born in Kenya, so he can't be a real American. Well, that's not the way that citizenship laws work in the U.S. You know,
So in a way, you have Obama inflaming racism in the reaction to him.
what you see are whites being willing to be inflamed
Yeah,
because of the presence of Obama.
yeah.
And so that is the work that whites in America need to do, is they need to have a much broader vision of what democracy could be. Because what white supremacy does is it undermines and it undercuts the viability of the United States. It does enormous damage. You know, when you talked about how your father just winced at the incredible loss of talent because of apartheid. When you think about what happened in the US after the Brown decision that said these segregated schools are doing damage, they are absolutely unconstitutional, begin to think about the loss of incredible brain power and of talent because the US refused to implement the Brown decision. I mean, that's what white supremacy does. It does damage to democracy.
Looking back at those incidents and looking at where we are today, including the Obama presidency, do you think, despite the racism that still exists, that a long road has been traveled toward a more equal society, more equal for all its citizens?
I think we are on that road, and I think that what we're seeing now is, again, that backlash. Because what you saw with that 2020 election was a vision of what America could be. In my state, Georgia, massive voter turnout. And it led to the election of the first African-American U.S. senator from the state, as well as the first Jewish senator from the state.
Plus, Biden won Georgia.
Biden won Georgia.
Democrats had not won Georgia for a long time, and that says a lot about multi-ethnic Atlanta metro outweighing the conservative Georgia hinterland. And that politically was very significant, I think.
Politically very significant, and that's where you saw organizations reaching out to their constituencies, getting them engaged, getting them registered to vote, getting them to the polls, explaining to them how to use absentee ballots in the middle of a pandemic. All of that was the heavy lifting of democracy that I just love.
So, Carol, I have to ask you the question everybody in Europe is always asking me, which is a rather depressing question. Is Trump coming back?
You mean like the vampire who just won't stay gone? Well, that is what democracy is about, putting the bright sunshine on that. So vampires don't like the sun. It's going to take an incredible amount of work. I mean, this is part of what you're seeing with the January 6th committee, as they're really exposing his role in the insurrection and trying to stage a coup. This is what you're seeing in terms of the multiple cases, the civil cases and the criminal cases that are coming through the judicial system. And it's going to, that's why, again, this 2022 midterm election is so important, because what it will do is it will keep the election deniers away from the levers of power so that they cannot overthrow the will of the people, the will of the voters.
So the answer is no?
No, he's not coming back.
Thank you. You all heard that?
He's not coming back. You know, we need to put that out there in the universe.
You can put a banner out front.
Right, he's not coming back.
So, the 13th Amendment, 1865, Jim Crow, what you portray there, the return of black men who'd been fighting for their country and they get shot at and abused. Civil rights movement, this endless struggle, and then Derek Chauvin's white knee on George Floyd's black neck for 9 minutes. And yet, black citizens of the United States perhaps believe more in the American dream. in the idea of a nation where everyone has equal opportunity and the rule of law applies to everybody equally. It's pretty extraordinary that belief has persisted. How do you explain it?
You know, I got that question a lot as we were filming,
Yeah.
in fact. And I explain it by a deep faith in what America could be, a deep faith in the power of democracy, and a deep understanding of what it's like to not live in anything that functions as a democracy. So one of the things during the era of Jim Crow, where the assault on voting rights was unrelenting. We saw it in Ocoee, Florida, for instance. We saw it in Wilmington. There was a time in 1942, so the Second World War is already launched. It's going hard, hot and heavy. In that 1942 midterm, in the southern poll tax states that had deep disfranchisement, the voter turnout was only 7%. Living in a society where only 7% go to the polls, Black folks know that the policies that emanate from that are absolutely destructive to their human rights. And so that's why we fight, because the alternative is absolutely abysmal.
What has been the reception to your movie? Tony was talking about touring around the US with it. How's it going down?
So far, it's been really positive. Part of what we hear is folks going, I did not know this. I did not know about Wilmington. I did not know about Ocoee. I did not know about Hamburg. And then the question is, what else don't we know about? And, you know, so I start talking about Ossian Sweet up in Detroit, or Elaine, Arkansas, and the massacre there. There are a whole series of these massacres. And a scholar has done the work that, for instance, on the lynchings, we hear about the lynchings. This scholar has done the work, and she's out of Clemson in South Carolina. And she's found that where there have been lynchings, you actually have lower Black voter registration and turnout. Because this is part of how this ground is haunted, how it is tainted, how the power structure has set in place, you vote, you die. And so knowing...
You vote and you die.
You vote and you die. Knowing this really helps with organizing. It helps with helping folks to see another vision. It helps with calling out the structures that strangle democracy, that strangle citizenship. That is why knowing this history is so important, and that is why we've had a series of laws that said, we don't want you knowing this history.
There's a very powerful line in the movie. I think it runs, "This nation has let white supremacy run wild." That is a devastating statement. This nation has let white supremacy run wild. You believe that?
Oh, yes. I mean, I just go back to the U.S. Civil War, the American Civil War, where you had the Confederacy attack the United States of America because the U.S. was not going to allow slavery to expand out west. Not that the U.S. was going to stop slavery in the South, it just wasn't going to be cool with it expanding to the west. So the South attacks the United States. Over 600,000 men are killed. And what does the President Andrew Johnson do after that assault on the U.S., after that fight to maintain slavery? He provides amnesty to the Confederate leadership and to the generals, to the military men who fought American soldiers and killed American soldiers. That's what I mean by white supremacy has not had to face accountability. It has run wild because those folks then came back and that's what led to Jim Crow.
As you look around the world, we're in Europe now, a rightist party with fascist antecedents just came to power in Italy. We have a war in Europe, in Ukraine, which is an expression of a new kind of imperialist Russian nationalism. In Paris, where I live, Marine Le Pen, financed in part by Mr. Putin, got over 40% of the vote and was in the second round. There's a revival of nationalist, anti-immigrant, racist sentiment, and things that were unsayable 15 years ago are perfectly sayable today, thanks in part to President Trump. So casting your eye a bit more widely around the world, we're here in Athens, how worried are you?
I am worried. I mean, this is one of the things we can't sleep on and act like it's just some little minor thing that will go away. I mean, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and we have to be vigilant. We have to understand the forces that we're up against, but we also have to remember that every time we have faced these forces, democracy has won. And that's what we have to know, and that's what we have to do. We have to be vigilant. We have to call this mess out. We have to make clear the consequences of right-wing ideology. And because they are brutal, they destroy human rights, they destroy societies. And then we gotta fight them.
Yeah, democracies are slow to rouse themselves, but when they do, watch out.
Ooh, it reminds me of George Kennan, who was in the State Department during the rise of the Cold War. And in his book on U.S. foreign policy, he said, you know, the U.S. is like, like one of those sleeping dinosaurs. You poke it and it's like, oh, leave me alone. You poke it again, leave me alone. And then you poke it one more time, it's like, don't make me have to come up there. And then you poke it one more time, and then it's like Godzilla, just knocking everything over, just like in an absolute rage, because you woke the bear. And I know I've mixed some metaphors there, but you know what I mean.
Well, you trample on somebody once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times.
Yeah.
It can blow. And I think in Ukraine, clearly the freedom and democracy of Europe are to a significant degree at stake. If Ukraine is lost, what's next?
Right, and so the way that the Ukrainians are fighting and the way that the nations have rallied around the Ukrainians, understanding that this isn't just a Ukrainian fight. This is a fight for global democracy. I think about Ukraine the way I think about Czechoslovakia in 1938, where Hitler is coming, and the Czechs were like, oh, we're getting ready to get it on. And you had the British and the French were like, oh, we're not ready to fight this fight. And so basically, Czechoslovakia was sacrificed. The democracy was sacrificed.
Peace in our time.
Peace in our time, Neville Chamberlain. And the result then is that we ended up with Hitler knowing that he could go as far as he wanted to go. And he did. He invaded Poland right after the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And so, hence, another world war.
Yeah, I think when President Biden said the other day at the United Nations that President Putin wants to efface Ukraine, he wants Ukraine to disappear, and then he said, whoever you are, whatever the color of your skin, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold. I thought that was very powerful.
Yes, because one of the things is that we have lived through that kind of genocidal violence. We have lived through nations and people trying to erase the other, trying to erase their very existence, trying to erase their culture, and we know that that is horrific. We know the bloodshed, we know the terror, we know the cost.
I think we're coming toward the end of our time. I'd just like to tell a little personal story, which is that my partner's from Alabama, and she once said to me, you know, you grew up in South Africa, at least partly, I mean, as an infant, and then I was back there a lot. And I grew up in Alabama, and that means that basically you and I grew up in the same place. And I said, yeah, sure, we grew up in the same place. South Africa had apartheid. And then the first time I visited Birmingham and went to the Civil Rights Museum there and went through the museum, I thought, okay, we grew up in the same place. I mean, the images were so familiar, and many of them could be in the South African Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. So, and you look at those images and you look at the length of the fight and you just think, and you watch your remarkable movie and you just think, how much longer can this go on? So how much longer?
As long as it takes. Democracy is worth it. Freedom is worth it. Liberty is worth it. Human rights are worth it. And when we don't believe that it's worth it, it sends us into the abyss. So as long as it takes, because these forces of reaction and white supremacy are unrelenting, we must be as well.
Thank you very much, Carol. And again,
Thank you,
congratulations.
Roger. Thank you.
One last word from me. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Carol, for a really interesting and inspiring conversation. Though at times I know it's really difficult to absorb all of it at once, I know you sent everybody home with quite a bit to think about. So thank you all very much. And to all of you who stuck around to hear the conversation, to be with us tonight, thank you again very much for being here, and I hope to see you over the course of the next couple of days. And one more round of applause for our guests up here. Thank you.